This is AWANI Global with me, Naila Huda. And tonight on AWANI Global, we want to look at tensions rising again in India and Pakistan after deadly violence in Kashmir triggered cross-border airstrikes and military conflict. So tonight, we want to unpack how serious could this crisis get. We've seen, despite the ceasefire, clashes and diplomatic fallout are still continuing. So could things get worse before they get better? To help me unpack these questions, we have Sadia Rahman, lecturer at Department of International and Strategic Studies, University Malaya. We also have Munira Mustafa, Executive Director at Chester Group. Thank you so much, Sadia and Munira, for joining us tonight. I want to start with Sadia. We want to just first understand the sort of bigger picture of what's happened in the past month or so. What actually triggered this latest wave of violence, and what made it so deadly and I guess escalate so quickly?
Thank you, Naila, for having me. To answer your question, we have to reflect back to the history, and I would like you to take you to understand that since British India was partitioned in 1947, the two independent countries were established. Post that, the relationship between the two countries have always been hostile, seen with deep mistrust and recurring conflict. So you see this enduring rivalry which exists between India and Pakistan not only confronts conventional military engagement, but they also have persistent cross-border terrorism, sponsored by Pakistan's support of non-state actor violence, right? So the region of Kashmir has always been the region of contestation and asymmetric warfare. Now, India and Pakistan over the past decades have fought four wars: 1947-48, 1965, 1971, and 1999. In all these engagements, military engagements, you see Pakistan has received major setbacks, especially 1971 when Bangladesh was created, and 1999 when India retaliated and claimed back its territory in the Kargil conflict. Now, fast forward, the nature of conflict not only just exists in the form of conventional military, but in the form of Pakistan supporting insurgency and cross-border terrorism. And you see, the cross-border terrorism comes from these militant or terrorist organization, which is known as Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jaish-e-Mohammed. So recently, what happened on April 22nd was in Indian Kashmir, which is in the area of Pahalgam, 26 Indian people was attacked and killed by the terrorists, which came from the Pakistan side. Now, this attack was seen as a red line by the Indian government, and it was actually expected that the Indian government would respond to these measures. Okay, the initial measures were the Indian government suspended diplomats. It also suspended the Indus Water Treaty. And after a few weeks, we saw that India responded with military engagement. And India labeled this engagement as Operation Sindoor, which was conducted in the night of May 6 and 7. And India regard this Operation Sindoor as a very precise military engagement targeting the terrorist infrastructure, terrorist air bases, and other launch pads, which was used to actually amplify cross-border terrorism and attacks against India. Yeah, so these are the reasons which actually led to the escalation of this current conflict.
Yeah, thank you for that really, I guess, sufficient summary. Munira, there have been close calls in the past, but what made this round of conflict particularly dangerous?
Well, I'd say that this was possibly the most serious confrontation in 2 decades. What really distinguished it was the expanded targeting scope. Like India conducted operations deep in Pakistan's Punjab province, while Pakistan struck military installations across multiple Indian states. Now, both countries employed advanced weapon systems, including drone technology, precision missiles, and fighter aircraft. And this went well beyond limited counterterrorism operations. Modi's statement regarding nuclear blackmail indicates a possible shift in India's approach to Pakistan's nuclear doctrine. The combination of expanded targeting, sophisticated weapons deployment and questions around nuclear thresholds while communication channels were limited. These created conditions where miscommunication could have led to further escalations.
We've moved on to, or we're moving on to this another phase, which is the ceasefire. That's what we're seeing this past week. And we want to look at what Prime Minister Modi says, or what he means when he says that India is only pausing its military action. What do you think he means by this, Sadia?
Okay, so India's response was Operation Sindoor, and Pakistan also militarily responded with this operation known as Bunyan or Marsus, right? And after that, there was a ceasefire negotiation, which was actually uh, announced on May 10th in the evening. And the Indian Prime Minister, for the first time, addressed his Indian citizens, calling this as a ceasefire, as only in terms of pausing it, okay? Now, what does pause mean here is India asserts its inherent right to resume military operation contingent upon if provoked by future acts of terrorism from the Pakistan, okay? It also means that ceasefire is a temporary de-escalation and not a long-lasting solution to this, which is lasting peace, okay? So Modi's statement from this perspective can be seen as a shift or a doctrinal shift, paradigm shift, that India does not tolerate any more cross-border terrorism. This also means that India's long-standing position, which is terror and talks cannot go together, which means negotiation, diplomacy talks cannot go hand in hand, and it is only contingent upon Pakistan acting on curbing down its terrorist activities. Okay. On the other hand, you would also see by calling this as some kind of a pauses, this means that India wants to send a kind of a strategic message to Pakistan and also the international community, demonstrating that India has a clear willingness to use its military engagement to fight counterterrorism. This means the idea is to eradicate terrorism, restore deterrence, which India feels that has actually waned in the South Asian region. So the approach, the terminology, pause, a ceasefire here means some kind of a disciplined restraint, achieving a strategic clarity. This should not be seen as a weakness, but rather as a calculated move to maintain control over the escalating dynamics in the region. Yeah, this is what I read.
Munira, maybe you have a different perspective on this. What do you think he means by pausing its military action, and what do you think is being meant by balancing or trying to achieve this balancing act between diplomacy and at the same time trying to stop terrorist acts? It's, I'm assuming, very difficult to actually achieve this. Things are moving very fast, and diplomacy is very difficult in a very tricky situation like this.
I'm inclined to agree with Dr. Sadia. I think Modi is characterizing the ceasefire as India's independent decision rather than a negotiated outcome. So this suggests that India retains the option to resume operations if deemed necessary. I think his statement that India won't differentiate between terrorists and the sponsors represents a significant policy development. This effectively reduces the distinction between non-state actors and Pakistani state institutions, broadening what India may consider as legitimate targets. If so, then this position creates complex security dynamics. If Pakistan faces military responses, regardless of whether it's directly involved with specific groups, it may affect incentive structures for controlling these organizations. So Modi appears to be establishing a new security approach with a lower threshold for interstate operations, using counterterrorism as the framework for broader military engagement.
Now, despite the ceasefire, we're still seeing reports of violence continuing along the line of control, or the LOC. Is this perhaps a fragile truce, or is this just business as usual? Is this the status quo? Sadia, what do you think?
Yes, you're right that on the night of May 10th, when ceasefire was announced, we see violations immediately after that, and both countries accusing each other of violating the ceasefire. India accused Pakistan of drone intrusions and also attacking military bases. Vice versa, you see Pakistan also claiming similar accusations. I see this ceasefire very fragile, of course. Why? Because you see, the ceasefire does not address the core issue, which is some kind of a comprehensive counterterrorism measure, saying that okay, uh, these steps have to be taken by Pakistan to stop cross-border terrorism. On the other hand, I have skepticism regarding its durability. Why? Because given the track record of cross-border terrorism, and again, India has seen attacks by the non-state actors from Pakistan, which is the 2003 India-Pakistan ceasefire agreement was there. Then also I think that was actually broken multiple times, okay, the 2003 ceasefire agreement. Then into 2021 also, we see some kind of a reaffirmation. And then 2025, post-Sindoor operation, we see this current ceasefire. So this ceasefire, although does exist, but it does not address the core issue, which I mentioned, and it does not transform the conflict dynamics, right? So, according to me, this ceasefire is like a temporary pressure valve, and underlying issues such as territorial disputes and I mean, something like not supporting cross-border terrorism that could only keep this ceasefire long-lasting. Other than that, I would also like to tell you that there has been a kind of a doctrinal shift. Why? Because you see, India has talked about by Operation Sindoor, it has given a message that it is deterrence by punishment, whereas Pakistan gives a signal that it is full spectrum deterrence and perhaps the potential uh, signal of tactical nuclear threats. Okay, so I see the ceasefire might have periods of calmness, but this will be punctuated by violence. That remains the dominant reality, unfortunately.
You mentioned or you described this ceasefire as being a temporary de-escalation or a pressure valve. How long do you see this staying in place for now? And at the same time, we're also seeing some analysts talking about the old red lines in the India-Pakistan relations that are now perhaps erased for good. Do you see this happening? What are these old red lines actually?
Okay, so when I was telling you in the context of doctrinal shift from both sides, you have to understand that the strategic rail guards which existed before was something about that the escalation should not go to that point that it becomes an uncontrolled escalation. Okay, so the old red lines or the strategic rail guards in the previous conflicts, it worked something as it is an unsaid way to keep themselves restrained from not getting the matter to be escalated. I'll give you an example here. So previously, when there were military engagements, you see that the strikes which happened did not happen in the context of attacking each other's, going inside each other's territory. You know, never crossed LOC before. So India, Pakistan rarely targeted each other's deep inside sovereign territory. Presently, in this Operation Sindoor and the Pakistan Operation Bunyan, you see both sides have entered deep inside territory right now. And the second thing is, initially, there was no direct attack on their military headquarters, installations, or other terrorist organization infrastructure. But in this operation, you see both sides have attacked each other's installations as well. Okay, so Operation Sindoor talks about airstrikes in the context of Pakistani territory, integrating into that and targeting their military installations and air bases. And India particularly selected those sites which has a record of sponsoring terrorism against India. On the other hand, Pakistan has sent crossing the LOC, drone incursions, and other missile attacks as well. So, according to me, these both countries have not only used advanced weaponry, they have used precise guided munitions, drones, and also has shown some kind of a readiness uh, to be ready face the situation and to retaliate. Okay, so this has a repercussion of amplifying or escalating the conflict to a dangerous level. Yeah.
Munira, your thoughts on this? Has this gone beyond repair?
Well, I would say that several significant security parameters have indeed changed during this conflict. I mean, geographic constraints have evolved considerably. Previously, operations typically remained within Kashmir and immediate border regions, but these confrontation involved strikes into Pakistan's Punjab province and across multiple Indian states. Frankly, the distinction between targeting military facilities versus military assets has become less defined. While India stated that it was targeting terrorist infrastructure, Pakistan directly engaged Indian military installations, indicating a shift in operational parameters. I mean, Modi's statements regarding nuclear deterrence suggest potential reconsiderations of India's approach to establish thresholds. And additionally, the suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty introduces resource security into the broader conflict framework. And this agreement had remained intact through 3 years, three previous wars since 1960. So these developments create uncertainty in a security environment where predictability is essential for stability between nuclear powers. The altered parameters potentially increase the complexity of crisis management in future incidents.
You mentioned this shift in operational parameters. We want to see if there's also a shift potentially in the tones of the messaging, the sentiments between the two nations. In Prime Minister Modi's first national address since the ceasefire, he did also warn that India would strike terrorist hideouts, as you mentioned, across the border if provoked again. Whereas at the same time, Pakistan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs described these remarks as provocative and inflammatory. Are we seeing a shift in tone, in the tone of these both governments? And how could this help or perhaps worsen the situation, Sadia?
Okay, so if there is a doctrinal shift, of course, the tonality will change. So definitely we are seeing a shift in tone. Both sides appears to be very assertive in their posture. Okay, India's stance when Prime Minister Modi came and addressed the Indian people, his stance was very clear. He talked about India's unwavering stance against terrorism. Also, he talked about that India will not tolerate any nuclear blackmail, which hints or signal that there might be some kind of threats coming from the other side. As we discussed already, India has mentioned the ceasefire as a temporary pause, which means India can strike back militarily if contingent upon if it faces any future terrorist attack. On the other hand, as you rightly mentioned, Pakistan framed this or sees this as very provocative, and Pakistan has also warned of kind of an aggressive response or future aggression if they face, they will also respond to that assertively. So definitely we see some kind of assertive posture, which will act as an hindrance in diplomatic efforts. And this can also result in some kind of further military engagements as well, making the ceasefire again very fragile. Furthermore, you see, both countries have taken efforts to expel their diplomats from both nations, right? So you see, there's some kind of absence of sustained dialogue mechanism, and you see this reduces further that they want to, open any back channel negotiations or diplomatic negotiations as well. So this environment of assertive posturing, the change of tonality, may lead to a cycle of provocation or retaliation that can further complicate the de-escalation efforts. Yeah.
Munira, what do you think about sort of the messaging, the kind of sentiment? What would be an appropriate kind of response in this phase of de-escalation?
I think both governments have adopted increasingly definitive rhetoric that constrains diplomatic flexibility. I mean, Modi's statements connecting militant groups with Pakistani state institutions reduced the strategic ambiguity that previously facilitated diplomatic options. Pakistan's leadership has expressed equally firm positions. Prime Minister Sharif I'm trying to remember, has described the exchanges as a historic victory and he claimed significant impact on Indian facilities, assertions that India has categorically rejected. And this rhetorical environment essentially creates what can be termed as commitment dynamics, positions that become politically difficult to modify. When leaders make definitive public statements about their positions and achievements, diplomatic compromise becomes politically challenging, potentially appearing as capitulation. So the hardened rhetoric affects it affects the essential security communications. So previous crises maintain some limited channels despite public tensions, and the current rhetoric complicates these mechanisms. This reduced communication that benefits groups seeking to prevent normalization between the countries. So, I mean, there has to be a way to dial it down.
I don't know if this helps or if it doesn't, but the United States, specifically President Trump, claims to have helped broker the ceasefire. What role do you think external powers play in this sort of situation, Munira?
Good question. External actors have concentrated primarily on immediate crisis resolution rather than underlying security dynamics. The US approach has evolved considerably from Vice President Vance initially describing the conflict as outside America's concern to active diplomatic engagement as escalation intensified. And then we have President Trump, who announced the ceasefire through social media before either India or Pakistan issued formal statements. This followed direct communication by Vance with Modi and the discussions between Secretary Rubio and officials from both countries. So the responses to this intervention revealed distinct diplomatic approaches. Pakistan acknowledged and thanked external mediators, including the US, Saudi Arabia, and China, which is consistent with its approach of addressing Kashmir through multilateral frameworks. And then India's response was more measured without explicit acknowledgement of Trump's role, which reflects its position since the 1972 Simla Agreement, which favors bilateral resolution. And then China's involvement reflects its economic investments in Pakistan through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And then Saudi Arabia, they maintain established relationships with Pakistan's security establishment. While this intervention achieved immediate de-escalation, it primarily addressed immediate tension rather than underlying causes. So the intervention hasn't substantively addressed the security dynamics that contribute to recurring crisis, and it's just going to be cyclical.
Now, we're coming almost towards the end now, but Sadia, I do want to talk a little bit about what sort of the effects or the impact this has had on, the daily lives of nationals, of civilians. Obviously, we cannot ignore as well civilian loss of lives, but when we're seeing some other retaliatory or economic diplomatic measures being taken and still in place, things like suspending visa services, unilaterally suspending the Indus Waters Treaty, banning visas, closing airspace to Indian aircraft on the Pakistani side, we're seeing this temporary pause in violence, in military action. But what are some of the effects of these, I guess, less visible measures, this retaliation on the daily lives of nationals and civilians in both countries, Sadia?
Right. So both countries have retaliated. And you see, India has suspended visa services for Pakistani nationals. It has announced the unilateral decision to suspend the Indus Water Treaty. And Pakistan also closed its airspace, banned visas, which in a way, of course, affect such measures are not welcomed and it affect the daily life people because you see, people to people connection is still strong. And the suspending of visas, which means another separation of families, suspending of visas, which means that you curb and curtail the cultural and educational exchange as well. And then closing of airspace means that it is a kind of a drawback to the aviation industry, which means that you are rerouting the flights that increases the operational cost of both countries' airlines. Then this also means that it increased the flight times, causing some kind of problems to the passengers. And then disruption in cargo and trade logistics will also affect businesses as well. So these are some impacts which the both country citizens are facing. More than that, I feel that the separation of families will create a longer impact in this present scenario.
Yeah. Obviously, a lot more that we like to unpack from there, but unfortunately, that's all the time that we have on AWANI Global tonight. Thank you once again, Sadia Rahman from University Malaya and Munira Mustafa from Shastra Group, sharing your thoughts on the India-Pakistan tensions, and obviously a lot to monitor for the next few weeks. What could develop from what's happened in the past month or so. Definitely something to look out for. Thank you so much, Sadia and Munira. That's all for today on AWANI Global. With me, Naila Huda. We'll catch you another time.